All right. So just a little bit of recap. The timeline, right there. Yes. You can. I'm sure. The timeline. If you were all able to wake up this morning and take a shower and get yourself here, I think you can figure this out on your own. So there you go. But it's important to understand the history. It was a very tumultuous time, and a lot of what Isaiah says relates to the power plays and the power structure with Assyria and Egypt and Babylon. And that's why it's important to understand that all of that's going on in the background, and then even the local smaller nations around Israel. It's just important, you don't necessarily have to understand all the detail and who was what, but Isaiah will mention these tribes and what's going on with them. And remember, at the time, behind the scenes, remember, Isaiah being a royal, probably cousin of King Uzziah, and having direct access to the royal court and to the high priest and all of the upper echelon, he was an elite as far as the nation of Israel was concerned. He's talking to the people that really are doing the politics and talking to the masses, the regular people in Israel that are making decisions like, hey, we are going to trust in Assyria or Babylon or Egypt rather than believe what you have to say about God and what we're supposed to do. And these same people that he's prophesying to, they're the ones also telling the people in Israel, hey, you can trust us. We know what we're doing, and, it'll be okay if we make this deal with Babylon or whatever. It's important to understand that historical context, because in that context, Isaiah gives a lot of prophecy and direction to God's people. Okay? And if you don't understand that, it's a real situation with real issues. And which brings us to a second point, which I touched on briefly last week, and I just want to state briefly again, another thing to sort of keep in the back of your mind. The same kind of thing is going on in our world today, and nothing's new. Nothing's changed. It's always been this way. Intrigue and garbage going on. What do you know? People get lied to by the government. It's an amazing thing. Yes, I know. Not our government, of course. No, I know that. Yeah. But there is in all these things also contemporary application. Similar situations and things, and we as God's people also need to remember to listen to God and follow His direction. So that's another thing to think about as we go through this. But yeah, so as we go through and read some things, and we'll, not as much, I'll tell you, I'm really glad we decided to go through Isaiah, and by we, I mean I. Really glad I decided to go through Isaiah, because just reading through it, it reads really nice, because like I guys told you, this really is the best as far as literature writing in all the Bible. Quality. The guy knew how to write. He was obviously highly educated. His illustrations are awesome. And the way things are phrased, it's fairly easy to take the ideas and concepts and transfer them over to us. So there's a lot of great stuff going on here. Yeah, and we're still in the introduction, really, and this goes on for a number of chapters, even though he sort of jumps right into it. And, he chews out the nation in general, then he chews out the rulers, and that's where we stopped last week. And now he chews out the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and then jumps right into judgment on Judah. And also remember, he prophesies during the ascension of Assyria. Assyria is on its way up, okay? And in 722 BC, Assyria will swoop down and take out the 10 northern tribes, okay, and carry them off into captivity, and they'll be lost to history. But then also, Assyria is sort of like a bright light that burned for not very long, and in the background, Babylon is also coming up. And toward the end of his ministry, Babylon starts to take over Assyria, and that whole thing is going on. And so those especially, those are the two big players in the world of Isaiah at the time. So here we go. Oh, and also Isaiah was a prophet to Judah, the two southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Okay? All righty. Any questions before we get into it? I've got an ambitious goal for tonight. There's a big chunk. I want to get through actually chapter 4. And for those of you who've been around for any other readings, you know that's ambitious for me. But I'm going to try and keep my comments to a minimum. But as always, remember, I've got it laid out here. I've got breaks and things. So if you've got a question, wait until I stop and then ask about what we're reading. So, okay. Here we go. We ended last week in chapter 1, verse 20. And it's the same pattern now at the end of chapter 1, verses 21 through 31. Another wrath and grace pattern here, just like the first two sections.
Okay, before we get started,
Yes.
Who is he speaking to from 20 on? Which group?
Basically the city of Jerusalem, the dwellers of the city of Jerusalem. First was the whole nation.
Okay.
Second was specifically the rulers, and now specifically Jerusalem, because that's where the movers and the shakers, and really what we're talking about here are the elites, the people that make all the decisions. Mm-hmm. Well, the elite are not necessarily the government. Oh, yeah, you could say the real government. Yeah. Right. Okay. Good job thinking. Yeah, the lobbyists. Good job thinking of contemporary application. Very good. Thank you for that. Somebody was listening. All right. Chapter 1, starting in verse 21. I gotta say, fabulous writing, and the guy knew what he was saying, and like last week, did not pull any punches. Okay? So here we go. How the faithful city has become a whore. She who was full of justice, righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross, your best wine mixed with water. Your princes are rebels and companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and runs after gifts. They do not bring justice to the fatherless, and the widow's cause does not come to them. Therefore the Lord declares, the Lord of hosts, the mighty one of Israel, I will get relief from my enemies and avenge myself on my foes. I will turn my hand against you and will smelt away your dross as with lye and remove all your alloy. And I will restore your judges as at the first, and your counselors as at the beginning. Afterward, you shall be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city. Zion shall be redeemed by justice, and those in her who repent by righteousness. But rebels and sinners shall be broken together, and those who forsake the Lord shall be consumed. For they shall be ashamed of the oaks that you desired, and you shall blush for the gardens that you have chosen. For you shall live like an oak whose leaf withers, and like a garden without water. And the strong shall become tinder, and his work a spark, and both of them shall burn together, with none to quench them. All right. Now, you guys, you got to remember, Isaiah said this to the ruling elite. Okay? That's like somebody standing in front of, what is it?
Congress.
What's that?
Congress.
No, the Bilderberg people. What's
the World Economic Forum.
The World Economic Forum. Yeah.
Yeah.
All these people. What's the big one in Switzerland?
Davos.
Davos. Yeah. Yeah. Could you imagine one of their own, because that's who Isaiah was, standing up and saying this to these people? How do you think they would feel about it?
Wow, humbug.
Yeah. Well, they would blow them off, and someone would say, "It's a little too close to home, Isaiah. That'd be a good time for you to shut up."
He mysteriously suicided himself.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. he had evidence that would cause Hillary Clinton to go to jail. All right, so now, chapter 2, judgment on Judah, the coming of the Lord. Chapter 2, verse 1 through chapter 4, verse 6. Now, there's a big section on here that I want to hopefully get through to tonight, which talks about the day of the Lord. And I want to give a little bit of background on that before we get to it. But first here, chapter 2, starting in verse 1. The kingdom of the Lord. 2:1. The word that Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow into it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Wow. Wow. If you notice, there is a ton of stuff in there. The house of the Lord shall be established as the highest, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and the nations shall flow into it. Okay? Don't just think about what was going on back then, but think about even today. But, chapter 2, verses 6 and 9, the enemies of the Lord. For you have rejected your people, the house of Jacob, because they are full of things from the east, and of fortune tellers like the Philistines, and they strike hands with the children of foreigners. Their land is filled with silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. Their land is filled with horses, and there is no end to their chariots. Their land is filled with idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their own fingers have made. So man is humbled, and each one is brought low. Do not forgive them. All right. So you can see, so far, right out of the gate, there is a whole lot of how great the Lord is, and pretty much how bad and evil everybody else is, including God's people, the nation of Israel. But there's always this thing, there's always, and you see this in the prophets, and you see this especially played out in very, very black and white, stark terms, especially in the minor prophets. God shows what's going on, calls to repent, and he promises always to restore. And we'll see that as we go through. That pattern is basically the pattern of the prophets. Okay.
Steve, I have a question.
Yeah.
1 through 4, is he talking about the millenniums?
Ah, good question.
Because it's kind of weird, you got these 4 verses.
Yes. Good question, and I am not going to answer that.
He's talking about the Latter-day Saints in the
Yeah, nice try.
That's what they
Nice try, Miss
they
Morgan.
use
no.
this, they
Yeah.
use these.
Oh, I know they do. Yeah, I know. Yeah, everybody. Yeah. Nice try.
No eschatology, Mark.
No, I'm not saying no eschatology because this next section is the day of the Lord. Dun, 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 which is
One of the days of the Lord.
very good, which is an eschatological topic. But remember, and thank you for remembering, because when we talked about this before, there is the day of the Lord, the great and terrible day of the Lord, also called the day of Jesus Christ, these kind of things. This is what's being talked about now in chapter 2, especially starting in verse 10. Okay? But remember, there have been many, you could say, days of the Lord throughout the history of the world, and they're all characterized, if you remember, do you remember what they're characterized by?
Big change in things.
God is running the world, and there is a shift in how things are done, accompanied by a miraculous outpouring. This is where our charismatic friends get it wrong, of you which you were one. But where our friends get it wrong, because they see the early church and Acts and all this kind of stuff. They think, oh, this is what the church is supposed to be doing. It's like, no, you don't understand. That was a day of the Lord. In fact, it was the inauguration of the new covenant. You could say that was the biggest day of the Lord there had ever been up until, well, actually, back up. Creation itself was a day of the Lord. Okay. The Exodus and moving into the land was a day of the Lord with all the miracles and stuff. The institution of the new covenant at the time of Christ and the early church was a day of the Lord. And what was another one? Flood. Okay, I don't remember all the different ones. We might be running out of them. Babylon. Tower of Babel. Yeah.
Sodom and
Oh, that's what I
Gomorrah.
meant. Sorry, not Babylon. Tower of Babel. Yeah. What's that?
Sodom and Gomorrah.
No, not really. I don't know.
That was just a city.
Yeah, with Tower of Babel, you had the nations
The
were
whole
founded,
world,
and every we're talking worldwide massive shift in the way things are being done on this earth. God's still in charge, but just the way He's running the earth.
Well, the flood would be one, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I said the flood, and so. But they're all marked by a certain amount of time. There's a beginning and there's an end. Usually there's a fade in and a fade out. Miraculous things are going on because, frankly, if God had not been doing miraculous things, nobody would have survived the flood. Anyway, so...
And there's usually a lot of warning leading up to them, isn't it? A lot of prophecy going out about it.
Yeah, okay, you can put it this way. It shouldn't have been a surprise.
Right.
Okay, but a lot I don't know, but it shouldn't have been a surprise. So...
The Tower of Babel was kind of a surprise, wasn't it?
No, because they knew they weren't supposed to do that. Remember,
Oh, they knew they.
Nimrod,
Yeah.
who was in charge of that works program, remember how this was not long after the death of Adam and Eve. There were people, remember, these people were living hundreds of years, and this is why the consistency of religion in the early church.
I thought the Tower of Babel was after the flood.
Oh, yeah, no, you're right, sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
Then never mind, I gotta back up.
You just-
Yeah, I gotta, now I forgot the question. No, leading up to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe not.
Noah was probably still alive or close to being alive, so
Well, they
you
were
could
kind of
substitute
sneaking
the
around
Noah
doing
there
that
instead of Adam.
Tower of Babel.
Yeah,
So
the
if they
thing
would've
is,
had
okay, let me back up. What I was thinking was, before the Tower of Babel, there was a lot of homogeneous in the religion of mankind because everybody, it was all coming from the family, the one, Adam and Eve, and passed on down through the generations, verbally. So, yeah, all of that, you could say the religious, philosophical, not just nation dispersion that happened at the Tower of Babel. But yeah, whether there was much info leading up to it or not, I'm not sure, actually. So, Luke, could you turn down, I'm really hot, can you turn that down? What's the temperature on that?
75?
Yeah, turn down to like 73, please. Thank you. Thank you. All right, but what we're talking about here in chapter 2 through the beginning of chapter 4 is the great and terrible day of the Lord. The big deal. Okay? So here we go. Chapter 2, verse 10. Enter into the rock and hide in the dust from before the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty. The haughty looks of man shall be brought low, and the lofty pride of men shall be humbled. And the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. For the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up. And it shall be brought low, against all the cedars of Lebanon, lofty and lifted up, against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the lofty mountains, and against all the uplifted hills, against every high tower, and against every fortified wall. against all the ships of Tarshish, and against all the beautiful craft. Just stop right there. That is good writing. Very good. Verse 17, and the haughtiness of man shall be humbled, and the lofty pride of man shall be brought low, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. And the idols shall utterly pass away, and people shall enter the caves of the rocks and the holes of the ground from before the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty, when he rises to terrify the earth. In that day mankind will cast away their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves to worship, to the moles and to the bats, to enter the caverns of the rocks and the clefts of the hills, from before the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty, when he rises to terrify the earth. So they're running.
Again, Mark's question about the millennium. That's one of the things in Revelation about men fleeing to the hills and
Yeah.
asking the rocks to fall on
Right,
them,
this
to
is,
hide them
this
from
is
the
the
terrible Lord.
official, which would be Revelation 19, the second coming. And notice what they're running from.
The presence of the Lord.
His glory,
Yeah.
his majesty. Verse 22, stop regarding man in whose nostrils is breath, for what account is he? For behold, the Lord God of hosts is taking away from Jerusalem and from Judah support and supply, all support of bread and all support of water, the mighty man and the soldier, the judge and the prophet, the diviner and the elder, the captain of 50 and the man of rank, the counselor and the skillful magician and the expert in charms. And I will make boys their princes, and infants shall rule over them. And the people will oppress one another, every one his fellow and every one his neighbor. The youth will be insolent to the elder, and the despised to the honorable. For a man will take hold of his brother in the house of his father, saying, you have a cloak, you shall be our leader, and this heap of ruins shall be under your rule. In that day he will speak out, saying, I will not be a healer. In my house there is neither bread nor cloak. You shall not make me leader of the people. Can you give me something to drink, please? Thanks. Verse 8. Water, please. Oh,
I haven't opened it.
could you open it for me? Never mind. Verse 8. For Jerusalem has stumbled, and Judah has fallen, because their speech and their decrees are against the Lord, defying his glorious presence. For the look on their faces bears witness against them. They proclaim their sin like Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to them. For they have brought evil on themselves. Tell the righteous that it shall be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their deeds. Woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with them, for what his hands have dealt out shall be done to him. My people, infants are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, your guides mislead you, and they have swallowed up the course of your paths. The Lord has taken his place to contend. He stands to judge peoples. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders and princes of his people. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by cursing my people? By grinding the face of the poor, declares the Lord of hosts. Okay, stop right there. A lot of this can be said about people and situations, even in the church today. Verse 16.
So, Steve, is he saying there that the righteous are going to be spared these judgments? Is he saying the righteous will eat the fat of whatever it was that he said there?
Well,
It sounded like they were okay.
Well, eventually they will be. I don't know. Oh, right here, I don't know if it's not really the point.
He's not really pronouncing judgments at this point.
Huh?
He's not really pronouncing judgments
No,
at
in
this
fact, it
point.
just says, grinding the face of the poor. Righteous people are being abused here, so. All right, verse 16. The Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks, glancing wantonly with their eyes, mincing along as they go, tinkling with their feet. That should be our memory verse for this week. Therefore the Lord will strike with a scab the heads of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will lay bare their secret parts. In that day the Lord will take away the finery of the anklets, the headbands, and the crescents, the pendants, the bracelets, and the scarves, the headdresses, the armlets, the sashes, the perfume boxes, and the amulets, the signet rings and nose rings, the festal robes, the mantles, the cloaks, and the handbags, the mirrors, the linen garments, the turbans, and the veils. What do you ladies call it? Accessories, right? Is that what that's called? Verse 20. I don't see any guys in there.
It's not an excuse to go shopping again.
Verse 24. Instead of perfume, there will be rottenness, and instead of a belt, a rope. And instead of well-set hair, baldness, and instead of a rich robe, a skirt of sackcloth, and branding instead of beauty. And here's the guys. Your men shall fall by the sword, and your mighty men in battle. And her gates shall lament and mourn, empty. She shall sit on the ground. And 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day, saying, we will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach. It is a desperate time. It is the destruction of society, the destruction of the family, because these 7 women at the end there, they don't have a family. They're finding any guy that's alive. And they're saying, let's, you can have 7 wives. Let's make a family. Let's yes.
Kind of what I got from that whole section was when Syria comes down to take it's ransacking.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
That is, the ransacking is a common theme
Yeah.
throughout this, well, and all of the prophets, the minor prophets. Remember, there's a legitimate spiritual issue going on, and there's a legitimate threat from the world. And so the prophet is telling God's people to repent, return back to God, and the threat is real. If you don't clean up your act, there's serious consequences.
I was talking to some more missionaries one time and about polygamy, and they said, oh, it's biblical. I was like, no, it's not. And they're like, yeah, it's in the Bible. No, it's not. And they showed me this 4:1.
Yeah.
I was like,
Okay, there's
Did you
lots
read
of
the
things
whole-
in the Bible that it records that are wrong.
yeah,
Just because it's there doesn't mean it's right.
yeah.
It also recorded a talking donkey.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, what's the saying? Yeah. It's which reminds me, how many of you have a watch? Okay. Or how many of you have a smartphone with a clock on it? You're all sinning, you know that. God said you shall not know the time. Okay. Right? Right?
Or date.
So apparently context matters. Okay? So just because it's in there doesn't mean it's promoting it. So, all right.
Now you know why I'm not a Mormon anymore.
That's not why you're not a Mormon. All right. All right. All right. We're gonna keep going. But here we go. Chapter 4, verses 2 through 6. There's, like I was saying, you guys, and you recognize this pattern as we go through Isaiah, and it said in all the prophets. There's a caveat, there's a but. Chapter 4, verse 2. In that day, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel. And he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy. Everyone who has been recorded for life in Jerusalem, when the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the bloodstains of Jerusalem from its midst by a spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning. Then the Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day, and smoke and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory there will be a canopy. There will be a booth for shade by day from the heat, and for a refuge and a shelter from the storm and rain. There's hope. That's the point there. From God, there's hope. As bad as it is, and as real as judgment is, there is still hope. Right. All right. Wow. This is going quicker than I thought. Well, actually,
You said don't ask questions.
I'm not kidding you. There were 3 times I almost stopped and said something. But
We're so proud of you.
yeah, I remember it took us a while to get through Romans, but Romans is a little different. There's, technical stuff. There's a lot of just great writing, and I mean, he builds and builds, and
It's a lot of
flows, and
a lot of reiteration.
yeah,
So it's not-
yeah.
So I have a question.
Okay.
What you just read was probably a series of sermons, right? Because if he would have read the whole thing like you just did,
Mm-hmm.
his hearers would be like, this guy's jumping all over the place. He's talking about judgment, he's
Mhm.
talking about millennium,
Mhm.
he's talking about Messiah. So, what do you think?
Okay, this is a good question. And I did not specifically look into this before we started. But what you're talking about is how did we end up with Isaiah in the way it is? The book of Isaiah. Okay. Now, I think I mentioned just briefly last week that Isaiah, Genesis, 2 Peter, these are the 3 books in all the Bible that are attacked the most by liberal scholars. Okay, and the fashion is now that the book of Isaiah was written by 3 different authors over a couple hundred years, and after the events, and then like somebody collated it. That's not true. There really was a prophet, Isaiah, that was really who it was, who really prophesied in Jerusalem, in Judah, during this time, this historical time. And these are the oracles and the prophecies that God gave him. Okay. Now, all that to be said is, you got to remember, is it wasn't like, oh, hey, it's Saturday, it's the Sabbath. Oh, yeah, that guy, that prophet Isaiah is preaching in the temple every Sabbath, and, so they go and sit down and listen to him. He went in and talked. We don't know how and in what manner and where and when God gave him all these things. And you got to remember, it's like, no doubt most of these were delivered to the elite and the ruling class, but he also, we'll see here as we go through Isaiah, he also spoke to the people. Okay? And these guys back then, it sounds kind of weird, but especially a royal prophet had an entourage. Okay? They had people that were around him. He had at least one, probably because he was wealthy and who he was, probably had 2 or 3 scribes that followed him around and wrote down everything. And also, like Paul, remember Paul dictated his letters, and the Apostle John as well dictated his letters. Isaiah, no doubt, dictated or spoke even some of these oracles, and then proclaimed the same message more than once, probably to different groups of people over different periods of time. And so whenever he sat down, and no doubt Isaiah sat down with his scribes and produced the book of Isaiah at some point, or it was like a running production, although there's a little bit of don't think of Isaiah in most Old Testament books as a strict chronological flow. Okay, so there was some sitting down and deciding how it's going to go together and put together. But all of that, it's all inspired by God through Isaiah, stuff he had preached, stuff no doubt he had said numerous times, some of them, maybe sometimes just, once or whatever. Probably the historical section in the late 30s, like 36, 37, 30, or 37, 38 through 9, somewhere in there. I don't remember which, but those 4 chapters, I think 36, 37, 38 through 9. That was probably written down as a chunk and like handed over as, something. But again, so yeah, it's not like, don't think like he just stood up and like was doing what I'm doing and just, yakety for a long
Not
time.
like Hebrews.
Right, like Hebrews, which is a sermon, or maybe 2 combined. Okay. Like here, wrath and grace for the nation. Who knows, maybe he stood on one of the walls in Jerusalem and shouted it out. Or, maybe some of these guys even wrote and had heralds go out and read what he wrote. Okay. So, yeah, as far as how that happened, we're not sure. But like I said, all to Isaiah, a real historical figure, really prophesying, inspired by God to do so. Him writing this down, his scribes writing this down, and then he, like I said, either as he's going through the years, or at, maybe at different points, sitting down and collecting things and arranging it how he wants. Okay.
What always made this book so hard for me is the way he jumps around and.
Well, that's why, yeah, especially Old Testament stuff. And actually, Jeremiah is the worst. There is no chronological nothing going on in Jeremiah. It's like a blender. But he put it, there's a theme and issue, stuff going on. And the same thing with Isaiah. So that's why I say it's a lot easier to understand if you understand the players and the time, and it's a turmoil and what's going on. Remember the prophetic pattern. God's people, the world, stuff's going wrong. You better straighten it out, and if you do, everything will be better. But if you don't, the Babylonians are coming down the road, and they're not messing around. So yeah. We in the West want a good didactic, we want a good conceptual, logical flow of ideas that we can follow, or we want a chronology, We don't want those movies where they cut in the middle and do like a scene from like 200 years ago, like background thing, and then back and forth. We don't want that. But they weren't thinking that, especially the prophets. Their main thing is, I need to communicate what God told me to communicate. All right. Okay. The next section here, Judgment on Judah. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 30. The Song of the Vineyard. The Wicked Vineyard. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. One last thing. That's right, I want to say. For like a New Testament example of this, would be the writings of Luke. Look at the beginning of Luke and the beginning of Acts, and he even says, excellent Theophilus, inasmuch as many have endeavored to write down and recount what's going on, he said, I thought it'd be best if I too sat down and looked into these things and wrote about them. Because Luke wasn't one of the apostles. He wasn't walking around with Jesus for 3 years and then wrote the book of Luke. He wasn't there. Luke gathered sources. Luke listened to apostles and people that had heard Jesus, gathered up these written sources that were around talking about Jesus, and from that constructed the Gospel of Luke.
Luke wasn't one of the disciples?
No,
Didn't know that.
no. No, he was a companion of Paul.
I always thought he was one of the disciples.
Okay? Now, obviously, all of that was guided by the Holy Spirit, and God worked through Luke to make sure that he just communicated what the truth was. But there's an example, okay. How can I really wasn't going to get into inspiration, inerrancy, and infallibility tonight. But you got to remember, a lot of people have the conception of like inspiration or the prophets or any Old Testament book or any New Testament book, almost like sort of, automatic writing, like they're sitting and all of a sudden they get zapped by the Holy Spirit and they write, and then they look down and, oh, wow, look what God said, woo, okay? No, I mean, people think that, and that's not at all what happened, okay? So, yeah, I'm just,
Carried away there.
yeah, I am. It gets exciting.
Carried with the Spirit.
Yeah.
Charismatic.
No, I'm not. I mean, yes, I'm personally charismatic. All right. So, but back up. It is when we Westerners approach the Bible and are looking because of our Western experience with literature, with information, with documents at work, at school, outlines that we've been, Roman numeral 1 and, and on down and, like that. We just intuitively bring this approach to literature and reading to the Word of God when the Word of God is not presented or constructed that way necessarily. Like I said, Book of Romans, there's some very clear didactic flow and, information and concepts go from one to another and, jump to a concept, explain, another concept, explain. That we know intuitively. But like when it comes especially Old Testament and Old Testament narrative or Old Testament prophecy, it's as far as genre of literature, it's a different breed of cat.
It definitely didn't have chapters and verses.
No, and none of this would. Yeah, but that was. It's actually nice. I got a nice newer translation in there with no chapters, verses, headings, no nothing. It's really good. It's just broken down according to the paragraphs in the literature. It's really. I probably should have read out of that.
What's it called?
It's the Bibliotheca.
What are you reading now?
This is the ESV. Which, the ESV is an excellent Old Testament translation. It's probably the best Old Testament translation of the newer translations. For the New Testament, the recently released Legacy Standard Bible is the best New Testament.
Is that McCarthy?
Yeah, that's the Master's Seminary one, which is an updated version of the New American Standard.
What language did Isaiah write in?
Hebrew, yeah. He knew, though, he knew Aramaic, he knew he was a very highly educated guy. Yeah. Okay. All right, you guys, we're going to be doing Isaiah. It's 66 chapters. We're going to be doing Isaiah for like 3 years, which is fine. I don't mind a bit. And also, this stuff like this discussion helps make it more accessible. So that's why this outline, if you notice, it's more of like sort of ideas and flow of the book, okay? Which is what we want. Okay. Here we go. Chapter 5. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. And he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? Just so everybody knows, okay, this is God talking about his people. He says, I planted a great vineyard and set it up, and it didn't produce what I wanted, meaning I planted you, the nation of Israel, and look what I got.
Sounds a lot like Solomon here.
Mm-hmm. Verse 5, and now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold, an outcry. All right. Wow. Very, man. What?
To take away the, trample and break down the walls.
Okay, so, all right, now this is okay. Remember, I love you and you love me. Okay?
You don't think it's that harsh?
Well, okay, but harsh according to what? I mean, at what point is it okay to turn against God?
Well, it's not, I mean,
Right.
it sounds like a pretty good rasp,
Yeah,
yeah.
well, it's,
Not that he's being over rasp.
right, okay. Over wrathy, I like that, I'll quote that.
Being over
Yeah,
wrathy.
yeah. It's cool, man. It's cool, dude. Don't be over wrathy, all right? Chill. All right?
It's my new favorite word.
I over wrathy.
It's like an invasion of the enemies.
That's exactly what it is. You know, it's, I mean, remember the people that he was talking to weren't stupid. You know, they knew immediately as soon as you talk about, oh, the walls and the hedges being broken down, you're saying we're going to be overrun by, remember, was it Syria or Babylon or Egypt?
I guess wild grapes taste bad.
Yeah, it's like,
can't
it's the
make
same
one
thing,
of
it's, yeah, you can't, it's, what is it? Olive trees have to be grafted or they don't produce edible fruit. Avocado trees have to be grafted or they won't produce edible fruit. I'm sure there's a lot of others as well.
So when God talks about making it a wasteland, do you mean that literally? Because until modern times, in 1948, Israel became a nation again.
Yeah.
Pretty much literally a wasteland.
Well, yeah, you have the, okay, this is very interesting. In seminary, I taught a class on the history of Israel. And part of it is this, from the Babylonian captivity, that's certainly considered a wasteland. But yeah, I mean, basically 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem, till 48. There's nothing there. There's some interesting, we should probably, you know what? Maybe we should do that in Sunday school in a few weeks, because we're going to be finishing up with the elements of salvation. That's just an interesting historical study. History of Israel. Just as a history of Israel, like as a nation on this earth kind of thing. Yeah, I'm not really talking about the Old Testament theological historical stuff, but just as a nation, just its existence on this earth. It's very fascinating.
Up to today?
Huh?
Up to today?
Yeah. Yeah.
That would be good.
It's very interesting.
A lot of things he said was gonna happen, did happen.
What do you know? God said it was going to happen, and amazing. And actually, that's the main reason why the liberal scholars have a problem with Isaiah, because they say, if this was written during Isaiah's time, we actually have genuine predictive prophecy that was specifically fulfilled, like when it was said to be fulfilled, in the way it was said to be fulfilled, and it's too accurate, so we can't put it back there in Isaiah's time. We have to move it till after the event. Okay, all right. All right, we can get through chapter 5. I know we can. Here we go now. Worthless grapes. Worthless grapes. Chapter 5, verses 8 through 30. Just a second. Woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field until there is no more room, and you are made to dwell alone in the midst of the land. The Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing, surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitant. For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield but one bath, and a homer of seed shall yield but an ephah. These are units of measure. Bath, homer, ephah. Verse 11. Woe to those who rise early in the morning, that they may run after strong drink, who tarry late into the evening as wine inflames them. They have lyre and harp, tambourine and flute and wine at their feasts, but they do not regard the deeds of the Lord or see the work of his hands. Therefore, my people go into exile for lack of knowledge. Their honored men go hungry, and their multitude is parched with thirst. Therefore Sheol has enlarged its appetite and opened its mouth beyond measure. And the nobility of Jerusalem and her multitude will go down, her revelers and he who exults in her. Man is humbled, and each one is brought low, and the eyes of the haughty are brought low. Man. I mean, it sounds, it's like, he's saying this to a bunch of people. Wait, what do you mean, what problem? Everything's great. What do you mean? We have parties like every night. Everything is fine. Verse 16, but the Lord of hosts is exalted in justice, and the holy God shows himself holy in righteousness. Then shall the lambs graze as in their pasture, and nomads shall eat among the ruins of the rich. Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of falsehood, who draw sin as with cart ropes, who say, let him be quick, let him speed his work, that we may see it. Let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw near, and let it come, that we may know it. Woe to those who call evil good, and good evil. Is that going on today? Who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight. Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the innocent of his right.
Drunk judges.
Yeah. Do you know any other country that has a two-tiered justice system?
Yes.
Therefore, as the tongue of fire devours the stubble, and as dry grass sinks down in the flame, so their root will be as rottenness, and their blossom go up like dust. For they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts, and have despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people, and he stretched out his hand against them and struck them, and the mountains quaked, and their corpses were as refuse in the midst of the streets. For all this, his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. He will raise a signal for nations far away, and whistle for them from the ends of the earth, and behold, quickly, speedily, they will come. What a fabulous, what a beautiful. It's like God, insofar as God is going to beat the snot out of Israel, out of his people, and just when you think he's done, he's going to whistle like a dog whistle, and here comes running the evil nations of the world to keep piling it on. None is weary, none stumbles, none slumbers or sleeps, not a waistband is loose, not a sandal strap broken. Their arrows are sharp, all their bows bent, their horses' hooves seem like flint, And their wheels like the whirlwind. Their roaring is like a lion. Like young lions they roar. They growl and seize their prey. They carry it off, and none can rescue. They will growl over it on that day like the growling of the sea. And if one looks to the land, behold, darkness and distress, and the light is darkened by its clouds. Wow. Wow. A vision of destruction. A bad vineyard.
Is this
Talking
for
about-
Israel or America?
No, this is Israel. This is Israel. But it's like this. Well, now this is not bad. Okay, remember 1 Corinthians 10, these things are written for our instruction. Okay. We can step back, and God's principles are consistent throughout history. Okay. All right. And so it's like this. It's not wrong to say, well, actually, let's back up a little bit. The theological reasons for this, it's called the image of God in man. Even fallen humanity retains the image of God. Okay? And because of that, and because of what is made, Psalm 19, Romans 1, all humanity knows there is a God. And all humanity, according to Romans 1, knows intuitively that there are right things and there are wrong things. Now, right things are defined by what is God according to God. God says what is right, and God says what is wrong. God says what is good and righteous, and God says what is evil. Okay? Without the Spirit of God, the world still knowing these things and knowing them because of what's created and what's made, will function in this world and create religions and philosophies and everything else according to this, and will define things as either good or bad, right or wrong. And according to Romans 1, they're going to mess it up. It's going to be twisted and distorted. Okay? Like Isaiah said here, some good things that are genuinely good, they'll call bad, and bad things that are genuinely bad, they'll call good, and everything in between. Okay? And though, like a broken clock, once in a while they'll get it right. This is what Paul said in Acts 17 when he talks to these philosophers, and they say, hey, look at this. You got to altar to an unknown God. Paul says, you're right. This isn't even a theological religious statement. And Paul says, yeah, you got that right. There is an unknown God. Only, without going into his Romans 1 sermon, he says, but you got it wrong, so that's what I'm here, is to tell you now what he's really like. Okay? So, we can look at this stuff, and since God made us with the image of God, and since the world knows that there is a right way for things to be and a wrong way for things to be, even though they're going to, twist and distort that and misrepresent it, okay? Guess what happens? Humanity, the world, even though it's fallen, and it's no guarantee that bad things won't happen, things work better when they run the way God designed them to run. Okay? Now we're not talking about, nobody gets saved by just doing the right things. You get saved only by believing the gospel. Okay? But it's like this. In general, if an unbeliever doesn't murder people and doesn't steal things and, all this stuff, in general, life is better for them. If they work hard. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to get cancer, they won't get hit by a bus, or, they're not going to, mugged or whatever. Welcome to living in a fallen world. Things still happen to people. Even nations, okay, and we'll see that you see this repeatedly in the prophets. Even nations, if you give justice to the poor and the widow, and don't sell it, and you don't have drunk judges, and you don't have a two-tier justice system, in general, even nations function better. Okay? All right? Now, but don't mistake that as like, oh, well, we're the good nation now because we're doing it better. No, it's just like that doesn't save you personally. That doesn't make you one of God's people. That doesn't make you God's nation just because you do it that way. That is just common grace, and this is, guess what? Since God is the creator, he gets to say how things work. and even fallen creation, if you just do it more his way, in general, things are better. That's all it means. Okay? Don't take it more than that. So, like when we see Isaiah here, saying, look, nations, if you worship the Lord and serve him and seek justice and righteousness, and he says, look, what are you going to have? You're going to have, the way he describes, blessings, vineyards and gardens and shade in the summertime and cover in the winter from the rain and all this kind of stuff. And people, guess what? If you don't do murder and all these other evil things, life goes better for you. That's why I say the principles are true. But a lot of people go awry when they try to find Isaiah 5 verse 23, that's this right here, specifically or something like that. No, we can't do that, but the principles are true. Okay. So, alrighty. All right.